Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, of course, from the flight deck as always. And that, of course, means some smart talk radio is in your future. In this segment, extremely pleased to have with us Beverly Gray. She's the author of a brand new work called Seduced by Mrs. Robinson, How the Graduate Became the Touchstone of a Generation. Should be an interesting conversation indeed. A little bit about Beverly Gray. She attended UCLA and got a PhD there, actually, in American literature. She is a prolific author. She spent nearly a decade in the film industry, where she was Roger Corman's story editor at both New World Pictures and Concord New Horizons Pictures. She covered the entertainment industry for The Hollywood Reporter and also leads screenwriting workshops for UCLA Extension Writers Program and lives in the glorious community of Santa Monica, California. What more do you need to know? Beverly, how are you, my friend?
I am fine.
Well, we're extremely pleased to have you here. Let's do this. You were closely aligned with the film industry for a long time. Obviously,
Yes.
The Graduate, kind of a bellwether movie in many respects. But why such an interest for you in this particular film?
I was exactly the right age to see The Graduate when it came out at the end of 1967, and I shudder to mention that that was 50 years ago. So I'm a little older than I used to be. And back when I saw the movie as a senior in college, I had the same feeling that a lot of my kinfolk, baby boomers generation, felt. We didn't quite know what we were doing with ourselves. Now, that's typical of a lot of young people leaving college, but we were also in a very complicated era. It was a time when the country was changing rapidly and radically, and where we had a lot of very genuine reasons to be unhappy with the world that we were graduating into. First and foremost was the Vietnam War, which had a tremendous impact on, of course, all the young men of that generation, and certainly the young women who were concerned about the young men of that generation. We were not happy with the world of our parents. We were not happy having to figure out what it was we wanted to do and figure out our own route for many of us, and certainly this was true for me. Don't get me wrong, my parents were wonderful people, but they thought they had pretty well figured out how I could have a happy life, and they were all set to tell me how to go about doing that. And I had had a little taste of independence. I had been overseas doing a junior year abroad program in Tokyo. And here I was back home, and my parents were saying, hey, how about going to law school? And think about getting married, and so on. And I didn't know what I wanted. So a movie like The Graduate, which crystallized that confusion, was really galvanizing for me.
Well, let's come forward to 2017. The Graduate has not been made, and it is released as a Christmas release this year. Does it ring hollow, or is there some application to today, do you think?
That is a really good question. It, I think, would still grab people for a number of reasons. First of all, it's extremely funny, it's extremely well made, and there was something extremely universal about young people not knowing what they want to do and being sure of one thing and one thing only, which is that they don't want their life to be their parents' life. But my generation had those additional worries, which I've mentioned, and those additional anxieties, and that fed into that. Another thing I should mention about today is that movies don't perhaps have quite the place in our culture right now that they had in 1967. In 1967, they were the fundamental source of entertainment. TV was nothing to brag about. There was no such thing as the Internet or video games or any of the other forms of entertainment that young people rely on today in such great numbers. Nobody was on Twitter in 1967. The movies were it, and this was the movie. It was a huge box office smash, and that was a big surprise even to the people who made the film, because they thought they were making a small little movie.
What about the theme? It's about graduation, but it's certainly and about future and about directions and choices. But the theme that you had, again, Dustin Hoffman had some success overseas, but this was his first big American film. How much of a risk was it with going with, in essence, an unknown? And if it wasn't Dustin Hoffman, were there other younger actors considered?
Yes, that's a great question. Dustin Hoffman was a real surprise to everybody in the film community who saw the movie. They did not think of a romantic comedy as someone starring someone who looked like Dustin Hoffman. This was the era of the tall, handsome, buff guys, and the basic assumption, I think even of the filmmakers going in, was that that was who ought to be playing the part of this very successful college graduate who had succeeded in the classroom and on the athletic field. If you started to think about who that would probably be in the typical Hollywood movie, you'd probably come up with someone like the young Robert Redford, who indeed was in line for this role. Mike Nichols had just finished directing Robert Redford in a smash hit Broadway show, Barefoot in the Park, by Neil Simon, in which Redford played very capably a young married, and Redford wanted the part. But Nichols, more and more, as he kept exploring the role, felt that Redford was just not right for it. And he said, this is perhaps apocryphal, but it's a great story. He said to Redford, Redford said, well, why don't you just give me the part? I'm right for this part. And Nichols said, well, Bob, let me put it this way. What is the last time you ever struck out with a girl? And Redford said, what do you mean? So he didn't have the hapless quality that eventually Mike Nichols found in Dustin Hoffman. Hoffman was a real surprise in casting. Hollywood said he was ugly in the early days. They said, why did you cast this boy? And articles that showed up touting this new actor said things like, a swarthy Pinocchio makes a wooden roll reel. And they said, Life magazine said, if Dustin Hoffman's face were his fortune, he would be a pauper. So it was a very unusual casting choice. It wasn't one that the common wisdom approved of. And yet a funny thing happened. When this movie came out, all those young people who weren't feeling too great about themselves saw Dustin Hoffman and identified and fell in love with him. And the rest, of course, is history.
Yeah, if you just joined us again, Warner Lewis here from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking to Beverly Gray, a prolific author and spent quite a bit of time in the motion picture industry, not only writing about it, but also directly involved. And she also teaches at UCLA, got her PhD from there as well. A brand new work called Seduced by Mrs. Robinson, How the Graduate became the touchstone of a generation. Bev, what about, again, Mike Nichols, well-known director, but how risky was this story for a major studio, and were there attempts to either soften the story or change it and make it not quite so out there, so to speak, considering the year in which it was released?
Well, major studios had nothing to do with this movie, as it turns out. The movie, first there was a novel, and a young producer, very eager, wanting to go out on his own, bought the rights to this novel, The Graduate, asked Mike Nichols, who had never directed a movie at that point, if he might be interested in joining him. And the two of them bonded over the fact that maybe there was something a little Catcher in the Rye-ish about Benjamin Braddock. Everybody in Hollywood has always wanted to make The Catcher in the Rye. That story of a disaffected youth has always appealed to Hollywood types. J.D. Salinger hated anything to do with Hollywood and has firmly refused to sell the rights, so there is not going to be a Catcher in the Rye movie. But here was something with some of those qualities both of them felt. They wanted to make it, and then they went around to Hollywood, to all the various studios with this novel and said, we want to make a film, and everybody said, not on our dime. They just didn't like it. They thought it was disturbing. They thought it was disgusting. They thought it was not funny, and so on. So what do you do in that case? You've been turned down by everyone. Larry Terman went to a man named Joseph E. Levine, an interesting character, quite a character, who was a brass guy, but knew marketing and knew how to get movies out there. And he had had a great deal of success. He was kind of a huckster. He had had a great deal of success taking an Italian movie called Hercules, a real cheesy sword and sandal kind of movie with a muscle man, Steve Reeves, taking his shirt off a lot. Joseph E. Levine knew how to sell movies like that, and on the strength of Hercules and Hercules Unchained, he was starting to invest in some slightly classier European movies. And this movie appealed to him. It was sexy. Mike Nichols was a guy on the rise. He was interested in working with him. So it was not a studio. It was little Embassy Pictures, Joseph E. Levine. That's where the money came from.
There's a very interesting side story, probably not known, about Doris Day and her relationship or non-relationship, so to speak, with this particular movie, The Graduate. Would you share that for our listeners?
I'd be glad to. Early in the process, Larry Terman, he's the producer, remember, he was always interested in the idea of casting against type, and he thought, what could be more interesting than casting in the role of this cougar, this powerful sexual woman, Doris Day, who's always been known for her perky, innocent, sexless, girl-next-door kind of comedies. How interesting would that be? So he sent the novel to Doris Day for her to look over, and according to Larry, it never got to her. That it was intercepted by her husband and manager, Martin Melcher, who was a very controlling kind of guy, and she never saw it. She says she didn't want to be in the movie. It offended her values, and that may or may not be, but she never received the book. So it wasn't a decision she was in a position to make.
What about, again, as they were shooting? First of all, do you have any idea how long it took from the time they began to the time the thing wrapped up, how long of a shoot it was?
I think, I'm not good at remembering dates, but I think it was about 5 weeks. But interestingly enough, there was a 3-week rehearsal period first, and this showed Mike Nichols' stage background. This is not the way movies are normally made. But by the time they shot the movie, these actors really, really knew their characters, had been encouraged by Mike Nichols to do all sorts of improvs and experiments. So a lot of this was not a movie where everyone was sort of improvising on the set. They were improvising in rehearsal, and then they knew what they were doing, and they shot a great movie.
You know, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but again, as you said, baby boomers in particular, this movie came at a time of tremendous social upheaval, tremendous social change, tremendous change in our expectations. You had a war going on. You had a lot of things going on with the relationship between men and women, all kinds of things. I'm curious as to if, again, shown to millennials, shown to Gen Xers, are their reactions the same? And is there, because again, there's all kinds of issues, obviously, about rebellion and all kinds of things. Do they have it with the same intensity, do you think baby boomers did?
Obviously, times are a little different, and sexual mores have certainly changed. I think where Gen Xers and millennials tend to see this movie is in terms of one thing that hasn't gone away, which is I'm coming out of college, what do I do now? I have talked to young people who have felt exactly that, who have fallen in love with this movie in terms of just the confusion of being young, the confusion of knowing that you want your future to be, as Benjamin wanted his to be, different from that outlined by parents. Obviously, some of the power relationships are different, and some of our sexual rules are different, perhaps, but a lot to identify with in this film. It is an edition film that's a lot of fun.
As far as you know, was there ever any discussion or exploring the possibility of any kind of a sequel to this movie?
You know, that's an interesting question. There have been attempts of various kinds to capitalize on the movie. There was not a sequel exactly, but there was a movie called Rumor Has It, and I guess it's about 10 years ago now, with Jennifer Aniston and Kevin Costner, which supposedly was about the family. This sort of posited that The Graduate was based on a true story, which it was not. But that these were the people who were essentially the equivalent of those other characters. And basically it was a silly movie. It was a movie in which the whole thrust of the movie seemed to be Kevin Costner, who was supposed to be kind of the grown-up model of Benjamin Braddock, ending up betting several generations of women, including someone who is, Jennifer Aniston, who is much, much younger. And this was supposed to be wild and crazy and fun. There wasn't much point to it, nor were the characters fascinating and lovable in the way that the original was. But, the author of the original novel, many years later, maybe 30 years after he wrote the novel, a own sequel, and it's a very odd book. He's a very odd man, and it's, of all things, it's about homeschooling, in which Ben and Elaine are married, have produced some children. They want to homeschool their children, which at that time was illegal in some communities. You had to send your kids to regular schools, and in order to have their way with the children's education, they summoned Mrs. Robinson to seduce the school principal. And it's kind of a cheap and clumsy book. It's as if the author, Charles Webb, didn't understand what the strengths of his earlier story had been, because this one just didn't work. It got a little splash when it came out. I mean, after all, people very quickly, if they read it, they very quickly forgot about it.
How much contact with anybody directly involved in this film did you have as you did your research and you compiled this work called Seduced by Mrs. Robinson?
Unfortunately, a lot of them are not around to be talked to. Mike Nichols, of course, is gone, and Bancroft, sadly, is gone. Buck Henry is not gone, thankfully, but he had a stroke and is not in good shape. So it was really hard to find people to talk to. I had a couple of wonderful and very long conversations with the producer of the film, Larry Terman, and his insights and memories were fascinating to me, along with the material that's in his archives at UCLA. I've talked briefly to Dustin Hoffman. I would like to have talked to him longer, but a funny thing I discovered is people like Dustin Hoffman have been talked to about this film over the years, again and again and again. And they've told lots of great stories, and the stories keep changing. So if I had sat down for 2 hours with Dustin Hoffman, I probably would have gotten a version of a story that I'd heard before, but not quite the same story, because it's not his fault. Memories are fickle things, and stories keep getting better and better, and I think we get farther and farther and farther from the truth of what really happened. So I did my very best to try to separate truth from embellishment. In the case of a novel that's a film that's a big hit, everyone starts polishing the memories.
Well, and there's also, in The Graduate, Richard Dreyfuss being one of them, but there are some people that are well-known today that had some bit parts in there as well.
That's right. Richard Dreyfuss is the obvious example. He has a teeny part. He's got one line. If you recall, Braddock goes up to Berkeley and takes a room in a rooming house, and at one point there's a disturbance in his room, and the nosy landlord pokes his head in to find out why Elaine Robinson is screaming. And the landlord, played by Norman Fell, is very upset, and he's surrounded by the other guys, other young men in the rooming house, and one of them says, "Shall I get the cops? I'll get the cops." And that's Richard Dreyfuss, who less than a decade later won an Oscar for playing the leading role in The Goodbye Girl.
Well, you have been close to Hollywood for decades. You followed the industry. You worked within the industry. Would there have been another film that would have motivated you the way this one did to write about it and do sort of a compilation and a reflection on it?
I am busy thinking about that now because, of course, now that this book is out, I got to do something with my life, right? So I've got to find another project. And it's really hard to come up with a movie that has everything that this movie has, that has absolute, that's a wonderful film on the screen. It's got wonderful backstories, has influenced people in important ways. I've spent a lot of time talking to people because I do believe that movies can change your life. They can change your attitude. They can teach you things about yourself. And it's interesting to me how people remember this movie for different reasons. For some of them, it was a goad into romantic relationships or encouraged them to cut off romantic relationships. I know one young man who, on the strength of this movie, realized that his old Chinese mother really shouldn't be living with him anymore because she was driving him crazy and he needed to have a life of his own. So movies can do funny things to people, and I'm trying to hit upon another iconic movie like this one that have such a powerful impact years beyond the movie's release.
Well, the work is called Seduced by Mrs. Robinson, How the Graduate Became the Touchstone of a Generation, by author Beverly Gray. Again, Beverly, a long time, well-known in Hollywood, has been around there for a long time, teaches at UCLA as well, and speaks around the country. Beverly, I think we know, but how can our listeners get a copy of the book and also maybe find out a little bit more about some of the writings that you do?
That's a great question. The book is available. It just came out this week. It's getting wonderful buzz, I'm happy to say. It should be available, obviously, online, but also bookstores, big ones, small ones. It's out there. I would love to tell people more about myself. My website is Beverly Gray, that's GRAY.com, and that will tell you all about me and my work with Roger Corman and all kinds of other things, which I find pretty interesting, and I hope you will too. And I write a blog. Twice weekly, I write Beverly in Movieland, which I describe as being about movies, movie making, and growing up Hollywood adjacent. So I have a lot of fun thinking about the impact of movies on people's lives, and I would love it if your listeners would join in that conversation.
Well, indeed. Thank you so much for spending some time today, and really, really fascinating work here. If you're a baby boomer or not, grab a copy of it, Seduced by Mrs. Robinson. Beverly, thanks so much, and have a great 2018.
Thank you. I do appreciate it. The same to you, and it's been a lot of fun.
Great. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.